Whitechapel, London, 1888. A place where shadows stretch long into the night, where the streets are steeped in poverty, disease, and despair. Thousands lived in overcrowded slums, where their windows remained dark and walls crumbled around them. This is where the forgotten survive, where life is cheap, and death comes even cheaper. In the heart of London's East End, Whitechapel stood in stark contrast to the wealth and grandeur of the West End. Here, the poor struggled to survive, trapped in a labyrinth of filth and vice, living day to day in decaying tenements and overcrowded workhouses. Prostitution was rampant, and the streets were ruled by gangs, thieves, and criminals. For many women, escape from this endless cycle of poverty and degradation was impossible. They walked the streets, selling their bodies to survive, knowing that each night was a risk they had no choice but to take. Crime was a way of life, and violence was never far away. But even in a place so accustomed to suffering, a new kind of fear was about to descend. Something colder. Something unseen. In this world of darkness, one man thrived. He moved through the streets unnoticed, blending into the fog and grime, but his purpose was different. He was not just another criminal. No, his was a far darker intent. Somewhere in the shadows, a hunter waited. Patient. Methodical. A ghost slipping through the mist, unseen, unheard, until it was too late. In the dead of night, this shadowy figure would strike without warning, leaving behind nothing but mutilated bodies and unanswered questions. And that person was no one other than man that would send chills down the spines of all who hear his name to this day: Jack the Ripper. The Canonical Five refers to the 5 victims who are most commonly believed to have been murdered by Jack the Ripper. There could be more victims, but these 5 women were killed in particularly brutal fashion, leading many to attribute their deaths to the same assailant. Mary Ann Nichols, also known as Polly, was one of the victims of the notorious serial killer known as Jack the Ripper. She was murdered on August 31, 1888, in the Whitechapel district of London. Mary Ann Nichols was born on August 26, 1845, and came from a working-class background. She married William Nichols in 1864, and the couple had 5 children together. However, their marriage eventually fell apart due to Mary Ann's increasingly unstable lifestyle. In 1880, William left her, and by the time of her death, the couple had been separated for several years. Mary Ann drifted in and out of workhouses, hostels, and the streets of East London, falling deeper and deeper into poverty, living a difficult life and struggling with alcoholism. Her body was found in Bucks Row, now known as Durward Street, in Whitechapel. She had been brutally attacked, with her throat slashed and her abdomen mutilated, in a pattern that became the hallmark of Jack the Ripper's killings. Her murder, along with the subsequent murders, caused widespread panic in London and remains one of the most famous unsolved criminal cases in history. Annie Chapman was the second of the victims of Jack the Ripper. She was murdered on September 8, 1888, just over a week after the murder of Mary Ann Nichols. Like Nichols, Chapman was a middle-aged woman who had fallen into poverty, and she had a drinking problem. Annie Chapman, born Eliza Ann Smith, was born on September 25, 1841, in London. She married John Chapman in 1869, and the couple had 3 children. However, their marriage began to deteriorate, probably due to their mutual problems with alcohol, and they eventually separated. After the death of Annie's husband, she moved to Whitechapel, where she made a living by doing odd jobs, selling flowers, and engaging in prostitution to survive. On the morning of September 8, 1888, her body was found in the backyard of 29, Hanbury Street in Spitalfields. Like Mary Ann Nichols, she had been brutally attacked, with her throat slashed and her abdomen mutilated. In Annie's case, however, the killer had also removed some of her internal organs, which led to speculation that the murderer had anatomical knowledge, though this theory remains debated. The horrific nature of her murder, along with the public fear generated by the previous killing of Mary and Nichols, intensified the panic in Whitechapel, with growing concern that a vicious, methodical killer was at large. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes were the third and fourth victims in the series of murders attributed to Jack the Ripper, often referred to as the Canonical Five. Both women were murdered on the night of September 30, 1888, in what became known as the double event, two murders occurring within the same night, just under an hour apart, in different parts of the Whitechapel district of London. Elizabeth Stride, born Elizabeth Gustafsdotter on November 27, 1843, in Sweden, was the third victim. She moved to London in 1866 and eventually married John Stride in 1869, though her husband died in 1884. After that, she turned to prostitution to survive. She was murdered in the early hours of September 30, 1888. Her body was found in Dutfield's yard off Berner Street, now Henriquez Street, in Whitechapel. Unlike some of the other Ripper victims, Stride's throat had been cut, but there were no mutilations to her body. This led some to speculate that the killer may have been interrupted before he could complete his gruesome ritual. The fact that another murder occurred shortly afterward has led to the belief that Jack the Ripper quickly moved on to another target. Catherine Eddowes, the fourth victim, was killed less than an hour after Elizabeth Stride, making her part of the infamous double event. Born on April 14, 1842, in Wolverhampton, Eddowes moved to London in her youth. She had a difficult life, marked by poverty and heavy drinking, and, like Stride, she resorted to prostitution to make ends meet. Catherine Eddowes was murdered in Mitre Square in the City of London on September 30, 1888, shortly after Stride's murder. Her throat had been slashed, and her body was severely mutilated, with some of her internal organs removed, similar to the earlier murders of Mary and Nichols and Annie Chapman. Part of Eddowes' apron was found nearby, and a chalked message, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing," was discovered on a wall in Golston Street, though the exact connection to the murder remains debated. Mary Jane Kelly, also known as Marie Jeanette Kelly, is widely believed to be the fifth and final victim of Jack the Ripper's Canonical Five murders. She was murdered on November 9, 1888, in her small room at 13 Miller's Court, off Dorset Street in Whitechapel. Her murder is considered the most gruesome and horrific of all the Ripper killings due to the extreme mutilation of her body. Unlike the other Ripper victims, much of Mary Jane Kelly's life before her time in Whitechapel is shrouded in mystery, and much of what is known comes from her own accounts, which may or may not be accurate. Kelly claimed to have been born in either Ireland or Wales around 1863, making her younger than the other victims. She reportedly came from a relatively well-off family, and at some point, she moved to London. By the time she ended up in the East End, Kelly had fallen into poverty and, like the other victims, engaged in prostitution to support herself. She was known for her good looks compared to the other victims and was described as having a quiet personality. Kelly had lived with several men over the years, including her most recent partner, Joseph Barnett, who had left her shortly before her murder due to her continued involvement in prostitution. Mary Jane Kelly's body was discovered in her room in Miller's Court on the morning of November 9, 1888, by her landlord's assistant, who had come to collect overdue rent. The scene was shocking. Kelly had been horrifically mutilated, with her throat slashed, her face disfigured, and her body extensively butchered. Parts of her organs were removed and spread around the room, and the level of violence was far more extreme than in any of the previous murders. Because Kelly was killed indoors, as opposed to the other victims who were murdered in the streets, the killer likely had more time to carry out his gruesome work without fear of interruption. Stories of the murders had spread like wildfire. Another woman had been found dead, throat slashed, body mutilated. They called him Leather Apron in the papers, but the people of Whitechapel knew him by another name, Jack the Ripper. Fear clung to the air, as thick as the fog itself. Shops shuttered early, homes were locked tight, and even the hardiest souls cast nervous glances behind them. Jack the Ripper had become more than a killer. He was a ghost, slipping unseen through the mist, striking without warning, then vanishing into the night. The police patrolled the streets in force, their faces tight with tension. They stopped anyone who seemed suspicious, questioned the innocent and the guilty alike. Bloodhounds were brought in, and the hunt grew frantic. But the Ripper always seemed one step ahead. No clues, no solid leads. Just bodies. But then murders, as quickly as they had begun, they stopped. No new victims. No mocking letters. Nothing. The fog still lingered, but the streets of Whitechapel were left in a silence that felt even heavier than before. The terror, though, remained. The people glanced over their shoulders, wondering if he would return. But Jack the Ripper never did. The police investigation into the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888 faced numerous challenges, including limited forensic technology and a lack of solid evidence. While the case remains one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in criminal history, there was some evidence gathered during the investigation. However, much of it was either circumstantial, inconclusive, or mishandled, leading to missed opportunities that might have solved the case. Several witnesses reported seeing men with the victims before their murders, but their descriptions were often vague, conflicting, or unreliable. The most famous witness, Israel Schwartz, reportedly saw a man attacking Elizabeth Stride shortly before her murder. However, due to language barriers and inconsistencies, this lead didn't result in an arrest. Other witnesses described men wearing dark clothing or caps, but no one could positively identify a suspect. The police had access to the gruesome crime scenes where the murders took place. However, the limited forensic techniques of the time, like fingerprinting or DNA analysis, were not available. The scenes were often compromised by onlookers, and the public, press, and police themselves unintentionally contaminated the sites. The coroner's examinations of the victims provided some clues about the nature of the murders. The precise, methodical way in which the killer mutilated the victim suggested some knowledge of anatomy or surgery, though whether this meant the killer was a medical professional was debated. Nonetheless, this information did not lead to any definitive suspects. Several letters were sent to the police, newspapers, and other entities during the time of the Jack the Ripper murders in 1888, claiming to be from the killer. While hundreds of letters were received, only a few have gained significant attention, though their authenticity remains debated. Dear Boss. September 27, 1888. This letter is where the name, Jack the Ripper, first appeared, and it is signed with that name. The writer mocked the police, stating, "I am down on whores and I shan't quit ripping them till I do get buckled." The letter also mentioned clipping the victim's ears off, which some thought could have been a reference to Catherine Eddowes, whose earlobe was later found cut. Many experts believe this letter was a hoax, possibly written by a journalist to keep the story in the headlines, though some argue its possible connection to the murders. Saucy Jackie. October 1, 1888. This postcard was received just 2 days after the murder of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, the double event. The writer referred to the murders, stating, "double event this time," indicating knowledge of both killings. It was signed, Jack the Ripper, and taunted the police about how they couldn't catch him. The postcard's timing and specific reference to the murders have led some to believe that it might be genuine, although others suspect it could have been sent by someone with inside knowledge of the case. From Hell, October 16, 1888. This letter is infamous for its more sinister tone and because it was accompanied by a small box containing what appeared to be half of a human kidney. The letter reads, "From Hell," and the writer claimed to have eaten the other half of the kidney. Catherine Eddowes had been found with a missing kidney, and although the kidney sent with the letter was analyzed, there was no definitive proof it came from her body. The letter was written in poor handwriting and grammar, which set it apart from the "Dear Boss" and "Saucy Jackie" letters. Some believe it could have been from the real killer, while others think it was another hoax. Ultimately, the letters contribute to the mythology and mystery surrounding Jack the Ripper, but whether any were truly written by the killer remains an unsolved question. There is speculation that Jack the Ripper had some knowledge of the police patrol patterns in the Whitechapel area of London, which may have helped him evade capture. While this remains a theory, there are several reasons why some researchers and historians believe the killer might have had an understanding of when and where the police were patrolled. Jack the Ripper's murders took place during the early morning hours, often between 1 a.m. and 4 a.m., when the streets of Whitechapel were relatively quiet and police patrols were more sparse. This suggests the killer may have known that the risk of encountering a police officer was lower during these times. The murders occurred in or near poorly lit, narrow streets and alleyways, which would have provided cover for the killer and allowed him to escape quickly. These areas were known to be difficult to patrol effectively due to their labyrinthine nature and high population density. The killer was able to commit horrific acts of mutilation in relatively short periods of time and then disappear without being seen. This could indicate that Jack the Ripper knew how to avoid detection, possibly by using back streets or hidden routes that were less frequently patrolled by police. In some cases, such as the murder of Elizabeth Stride, it is believed that the killer may have been interrupted, yet he was still able to escape unnoticed. The murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes on the same night, September 30, 1888, the so-called double event, are particularly telling. The fact that the killer was able to commit two murders in different locations, less than an hour apart, suggests a degree of confidence in his ability to evade law enforcement. Catherine Eddowes' body was found in Mitre Square, which was located in the jurisdiction of the City of London Police, just outside the territory covered by the Metropolitan Police. This indicates the killer may have been aware of the different policing boundaries, and the lack of coordination between the two forces may have worked in his favor. After the murder of Annie Chapman in early September 1888, the police dramatically increased patrols in the Whitechapel area, including the use of plainclothes officers and more frequent night patrols. Despite this increased presence, Jack the Ripper was still able to carry out the double event, suggesting he was able to work around these additional patrols. Many ripperologists, experts on the case, believe that Jack the Ripper was likely a local resident or someone who spent a lot of time in Whitechapel. The killer's familiarity with the geography of the area, including the intricate network of streets, alleys, and passageways, could have helped him avoid police patrols and make quick getaways after the murders. There are also theories suggesting the killer could have been someone with inside knowledge of police patrols, such as a policeman or a figure involved in the local community, which would explain how he was able to avoid capture. However, these theories remain speculative and are not universally accepted. There are numerous theories about the identity of Jack the Ripper, ranging from plausible suspects to more sensational or far-fetched ideas. Over the years, dozens of individuals have been proposed as the notorious killer, and while none have been conclusively proven to be Jack the Ripper, several theories have gained significant attention. Montague John Druitt was a barrister and schoolteacher whose body was found in the River Thames in December 1888, shortly after the last of the Canonical Five murders. He was around 31 years old at the time of his death, and his suicide led to speculation that he could have been Jack the Ripper. Druitt's death coincided with the end of the Ripper murders, leading some to believe that the killing stopped because the killer took his own life. He was reportedly of unsound mind, according to family members, which has fueled speculation that he might have had violent tendencies. There is no direct evidence linking Druitt to the murders, and his whereabouts during the killings are unclear. Druitt came from a respectable family and did not fit the profile of someone living in the poverty-stricken areas of Whitechapel. Aaron Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel and worked as a barber. He was admitted to a mental asylum in 1891, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. Several police officials, including Chief Inspector Donald Swanson, later indicated that Kosminski was a prime suspect but could not be convicted due to a lack of evidence. A witness reportedly identified him as the killer, but the identification was never formalized. In 2014, a controversial DNA analysis of a shawl supposedly found near Catherine Eddowes' body linked Kosminski to the murder, though the methodology and authenticity of the shawl have been widely criticized. The DNA evidence is disputed, with many experts arguing that the shawl had no proven connection to the crime scene and could have been contaminated over the years. Kosminski's mental illness made it unlikely that he could have carried out the murders with the precision and planning they required. Sir William Gull was the royal physician to Queen Victoria. He became a suspect in the royal conspiracy theory, which suggests that the murders were part of a cover-up orchestrated by the British royal family. The theory, popularized in the 1970s by authors such as Stephen Knight in Jack the Ripper, The Final Solution, claims that Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson, had an illegitimate child with a woman in Whitechapel. To cover up the scandal, the murders were ordered, and Gull was supposedly involved in silencing witnesses. Some versions of the theory suggest that Gull, as a Freemason, was part of a larger conspiracy. This theory has been largely discredited by historians, who point out that there is no concrete evidence of Prince Albert Victor's involvement or any royal connection to the murders. The theory relies heavily on speculation and is based on unreliable sources and conspiracy thinking. George Chapman, born Søren Klusowski, was a Polish immigrant and serial killer who poisoned several of his wives in the 1890s. He was hanged in 1903 for his crimes. Chapman was living in Whitechapel at the time of the Ripper murders, and he later went on to become a known murderer, which led some to speculate that he may have been the Ripper. Inspector Frederick Aberline, who investigated the Ripper murders, believed Chapman could have been the killer. Chapman's method of killing, poisoning, was very different from the brutal slashing and mutilation associated with Jack the Ripper. There is no direct evidence linking Chapman to the Ripper murders, and the time gap between the two sets of crimes raises doubts. James Maybrick was a Liverpool cotton merchant who died in 1889, a year after the Ripper murders. He became a suspect due to the discovery of a controversial diary in 1992, purportedly written by Maybrick, in which he confessed to being Jack the Ripper. The Maybrick Diary contains detailed confessions and descriptions of the murders that could indicate insider knowledge of the crimes. Maybrick's wife was convicted of his murder, leading some to speculate that he may have had violent tendencies. The authenticity of the Maybrick Diary is highly disputed. Many experts believe it is a modern forgery, and the evidence supporting Maybrick as Jack the Ripper is weak. There is no concrete link between Maybrick and the Whitechapel area, where the murders took place. Francis Tumblety was an American quack doctor and known misogynist who was in London during the time of the Ripper murders. He was arrested on unrelated charges of gross indecency in 1888 but fled to the United States before he could be questioned about the murders. Tumblety was known for his hatred of women, especially prostitutes, which aligns with the nature of the Ripper killings. His sudden flight from London after the murders and his criminal background raised suspicions. Tumblety's movements were not conclusively linked to the times and locations of the murders, and there is no solid evidence connecting him to the killings. His known method of operation was not violent murder, making it unlikely he was Jack the Ripper. Each of these suspects has their own set of supporting evidence and counterarguments, but no theory has been definitively proven. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of history's greatest mysteries, with new theories and potential suspects continuing to emerge over time. The investigation may have faded, but the mystery only deepened. Who was Jack the Ripper? A doctor, skilled in anatomy? A butcher, used to the precision of his cuts? Or an aristocrat, hiding in plain sight? As the years passed, the theories swirled and the legend took root. Jack the Ripper was no longer just a man, he had become a specter haunting the darkest corners of history. The streets of Whitechapel no longer bled, but the fear never truly left. His name became more than a symbol of death, it became a myth, a ghostly presence that drifted through the fog, leaving behind only questions. The hunt had ended long ago, but it wasn't a man they had been chasing. They had been pursuing a shadow, a phantom that would forever linger in London's nightmares. Now, over a century later, Jack the Ripper's shadow still looms over London. The narrow alleys where he once stalked his victims are part of history, yet the questions remain. Who was he? Why did he kill? And why did he stop? Perhaps we'll never know. Perhaps he's still out there, not as flesh and blood, but as a whisper in the night, a shadow that drifts through the fog that never truly lifts from the streets of Whitechapel. The Ripper is gone, but his presence endures, etched into the fabric of the city, a haunting reminder that some mysteries are never meant to be solved.